Welcome back to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, a journalist and creator of the show, and if you are new to the podcast, I created Dead Sleep for people like me. People who struggle with insomnia and want an intriguing story, a mindful mystery, to unwind your mind before bed. And I don't know what your reasons are for your insomnia, but you can rest easy knowing Dead Sleep is ad-free. So there will be no big, loud, obnoxious ads blasting you awake. And I definitely rest easier when I hear that people enjoy the show so much that they are excited to support it. There are a lot of true crime shows out there, so I do not take your support for granted. You can subscribe to this podcast via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Patreon. Oh, and a heads up that I will be dropping another Dead Sleep Naked episode in a few days. That is the fourth of a 6-part series that's included in the subscriber feed. Dead Sleep Naked is an existing episode of the show handpicked by me and just the narration. No music or sound effects for people who just want the stories of Dead Sleep au naturel. Tonight's episode was inspired by a shocking headline I came across recently about a very rich man who made a fortune in the tech industry until his erratic behavior and drug problems led to disastrous consequences and a stupefying downfall. A man who had everything until his dependence on chemicals, including a potent anesthetic called ketamine, pushed his mind and body over the edge. And believe it or not, I'm not referring to a certain billionaire you've heard plenty about. I'm referring to a tech luminary who isn't a household name. But I suspect you might be hearing his name, his scandals, and the mystery around his life and death in the coming weeks. His name was Tony Hsieh, the former CEO of Zappos, a near billionaire whose net worth was once an estimated $850 million before he died under horrific circumstances the day after Thanksgiving in 2020 at the age of just 46. A death caused by fatal carbon monoxide poisoning that would be medically and legally classified as an accident. But for those who were there that day in November, who witnessed Tony Hsieh's behavior in a locked tool shed on a freezing cold night in New London, Connecticut, they'd swear it was a suicide, while others in Tony's orbit would claim it was a form of reckless homicide, that Tony died, more or less, at the hands of the people around him. Hustlers and enablers who leached the tech multimillionaire for everything he had until there was nothing left. But there was something left. When Tony died, he left behind a sizable fortune. A reported $500 million, though it's hard to know for sure. In the end, his finances were a knot of impulse investments, various properties, and an ambitious and ill-fated scheme that included a community that took over the entire downtown of Las Vegas, Nevada. All of it left in free fall after his passing. Because Tony Hsieh, a tech mogul who'd been a multimillionaire since the age of 25, had died without leaving a will. And it seemed impossible that a successful legend like Tony would leave this world with no estate planning, no nothing, except for a few vague, inscrutable Post-it notes and some loose pieces of paper. He never married, he had no children, so these past 5 years, it's been up to his father, Richard, to untangle the tech titan's multi-millions, which has turned out to be an all-consuming legal battle over his estate, a multi-million-dollar minefield with lawsuits and random claims to Tony's fortune that took years to resolve. And finally, in 2025, it seemed settled. And then, like something out of Charles Dickens or film noir, a twist. In late May, it was reported, seemingly out of nowhere, Tony Hsieh's last will and testament appeared. One that he'd apparently created, signed, and dated in 2015, 10 years ago. Only the appearance of this mystery will has sparked more questions than answers. The lawyer who drew up the will, the family hadn't heard of him. What's more, he'd passed away, and Tony's will was found among his things. So is this will legitimate? What does it contain? And what could this all mean for the tarnished legacy of one of Silicon Valley's greatest visionaries and one of its most painful cautionary tales? Now, there's a court date scheduled in July of 2025, that's next month, to begin the process of understanding what this will means. Because meaning, that was something Tony Hsieh sought in his brief life. A singular obsession, a never-ending pursuit of a life filled with one thing: happiness. Tony Hsieh isn't as well known as Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos or even Elon Musk. But at one time, he was one of Silicon Valley's most beloved CEOs, one of the good ones, who claimed the secret to his success at Zappos was simple. You had to think people, not profits, first. Back in the late 2000s, before my true crime life, I covered technology and business and culture for magazines like Wired and Fast Company. And the buzz around Tony was that he had taken kind of a boring company like Zappos and had made it exciting because he had this whole emphasis on community and culture. He seemed to strike this impossible balance of someone who was very rich, very ambitious, ran Zappos, a huge company, and yet somehow seemed down to earth. And he cultivated this new age style capitalist dream that if you followed your passion, the profits would follow. That was true, at least for Tony. I remember thinking of Tony Hsieh as this breath of fresh air, a millionaire with a mission. I didn't know Tony Hsieh. I had no idea what was really going on. Nobody really did. No one could have predicted how his message, his whole brand of happiness, would turn so dark and deadly. A dangerous illusion he fueled with money, drugs, and a demand for loyalty that went well beyond the scope of a powerful CEO and into the unnerving behavior of a cult leader. And yet, even with all that power and all of those multi-millions of dollars, Tony would discover the hard way that happiness would be the one thing his money couldn't buy. Now, Tony's story was a tragedy, and now with this new will, it's a mystery. And as the details about this will emerge, it seemed relevant and timely to revisit the saga of Tony Hsieh and offer an inside look, facts drawn from a 2023 book written about Tony called Wonder Boy, and specifics drawn from his own memoir, which he published in 2010, along with my own experience and research. And just so we're all clear, this is a sad story with a lot of dark elements. But I hope by revisiting Tony's story, we will get a more informed picture on the billionaires who roam among us now, the hazards of celebrity culture with tech titans, and a peek behind the platinum curtain of what happens when you become so rich that you build a world where no one ever tells you the truth. It's a world of yes, where no one says no, and you never say never. Because that was the world of Silicon Valley in the 1990s. A tech boom where anything was possible, where Tony Hsieh cut his teeth, where he learned if you want to be at the top, you never say never. Anything is possible, and the only thing limiting you is yourself. Fix the glitch in yourself, and you'll find the path. In fact, it was one of Tony Hsieh's favorite quotes from one of Tony's favorite movies, The Matrix. A bit of Zen wisdom offered by Morpheus, a character played by Lawrence Fishburne. There is a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. It's a quote he loves so much, he opens with it in his memoir. A best-selling book/business manifesto he published in 2010 titled Delivering Happiness, A Path to Profits, Passion, and Purpose. Tony, he knew the path. He walked the path. So how did he end up getting so lost? In the beginning, Tony's path to success was well-traveled. A roadmap followed by just about every tech wunderkind, from Bill Gates to Mark Zuckerberg. Young nerd goes to Harvard, young nerd goes west, young nerd finds fortune. Only in Tony's case, he grew up in Marin County, in the shadow of Silicon Valley, as a kid in the 1980s, with his parents and 2 younger brothers. His mother was a social worker and his father an engineer at Chevron. Both originally from Taiwan, the two met here in the United States while attending graduate school in the Midwest. And while his family was financially quite comfortable, by Tony's own admission, he had an obsession with making money. He had no hobbies. He had profit-making enterprises. Money could buy things, Tony understood that. But for him, money was freedom. From the drudgery of everyday life, from the outsized expectations of his parents. And for Tony, as a child and in his adult life, money could communicate in a way that he could not. He wasn't a big talker, and he avoided conflict at all costs, resorting to extreme and underhanded methods to get out of things he didn't want to do. An example from his childhood was when he felt overwhelmed by the number of music lessons he had to take every day, and the hours spent practicing piano. So he figured out a way to get that time back, that he could get the points for playing piano without actually doing the practicing. He recorded himself practicing the piano once. And after that, in the mornings when it was time to practice and his parents were in another room or still asleep, he'd simply play that recording, hoodwinking his parents into thinking he was practicing. And Tony, he'd be in the corner in a chair, relaxed, reading a copy of his favorite magazine, Boy's Life. It seems he was a born entrepreneur. Tony did everything from lemonade stands to worm farms to a button-making business to buying and reselling pizzas and McDonald's at marked-up prices at Harvard. Each time finding a new way to maximize profits and optimize workflow. But sometimes even his most well-intentioned schemes wouldn't turn out the way he planned. In one story from his childhood, Tony wanted to sell worms, so he bought a worm farm, which was more or less a big box of composting soil with starter worms that came with it. And at first, he planned to cut the worms in half because he learned that worms could be cut in half, and you could have 2 living worms, which for Tony meant doubling his potential profits as a newfound worm farmer. But he decided that was too messy and difficult. Instead, what he wanted was to find a way to have the worms grow faster. And to do this, he decided to pour egg yolks into the soil, figuring that all the nutrients from those egg yolks would go into the soil, feed the worms, and those worms would grow healthy and strong, superior worms that he could sell and outpace his competition. Much to his surprise, when he went to collect all of these new, strong worms, there weren't any there. Because the egg yolks had attracted birds, and the birds had eaten all the worms. And even those worms who were lucky enough to not get picked off by a bird, they ended up drowning, killed more or less in a flood of raw egg yolks. Tony was devastated. He'd failed. He'd killed the worms and lost his whole business. But he didn't want to say that to his father. So instead, he told his father that it didn't matter. He was bored with worm farming anyway. But in his heart, he knew that wasn't quite true. And sure, he was just a kid. But looking back, it was some early, high-protein foreshadowing. When Tony had enough power to try and fortify the lives of the people who worked for him, taking it upon himself to improve his employees. Ultimately, of course, for his own profit, with the impulse to disguise his own failure under a mask of indifference. But that was the culture of Silicon Valley, where there was no such thing as failure, just suboptimal results. Living in San Francisco as a recent Harvard graduate, working in the tech space in the mid-1990s, it was evident he had a startup spirit, that he was happiest when he had a big challenge, and he needed to run the show. That's when he and his business partner and Harvard buddies started their own company. And within 2 years, that's by the age of 25, they sold their company, called Link Exchange, for $265 million to Microsoft, with each guy, that's Tony and his partner, walking away with just under $40 million apiece. For Tony, money was freedom. And he'd done it. He'd earned his freedom. With enough money to live for the rest of his life. And he wasn't even 30. But the allure of freedom was more appealing in theory, it turns out, than actuality. By yourself, freedom felt more like loneliness. Tony wasn't the most outgoing guy in the world, but he loved throwing parties. He especially loved the feeling of knowing that he was responsible for orchestrating someone else's good time. And for a while, he secretly fantasized that he could have a career as a party planner. But he knew, as a Harvard graduate with parents who had huge expectations, having a job as professional party planner probably sounded a little silly. But by the time he was a multimillionaire, he loved throwing parties at his place, which was by then a 3,500 square foot loft space in downtown San Francisco. And he wanted to live a real-life version of the show Friends. There was always someone to joke with, drink with. You were never lonely. And eventually, he arranged for the purchase of most of the apartments in the building, taking over the whole building and using it as a workspace, even owning the restaurant. like his very own central perk from the show Friends. So his friends and family, including his younger brother, Andy, they could all be there and never have to leave. From Harvard to now in San Francisco, Tony was like a born cultivator of community, a skill he would expand in the early 2000s when he joined Zappos as co-CEO, taking the struggling online shoe store into a brisk online business. And along with that, he developed a groundbreaking work culture, one that did not feel corporate at all, but like going to work every day with your friends. Culture was a big buzzword back then, with a young generation of fresh tech workers who didn't want to see their job as a 9-to-5 clock in and punch out, but a career that was aligned with who they were as people, shared values, doing more than work, being part of something that mattered. And by the second dot-com wave, that was around the early to mid-2000s, Google was probably emerging as the best known for this work culture. A campus that everyone talked about, how there were all these perks, from great benefits to flex time to free food, free yoga, free massage with an on-site massage therapist. A shuttle that took employees to and from work. Showers, beds, snacks. Google made it so it felt like a home away from home, a place you never had to leave. Your job was there. Your friends were there. Your romantic encounters most likely were sparked there. And as you matured, Google matured with you. From helping finance infertility treatments for aspiring parents to generous parental leave packages. Tech companies like Google were on the vanguard of meeting and exceeding employee demands. And to their credit, future companies who wanted top talent would have to meet those demands. Because it wasn't just a job. You were following your passion. Tony Hsieh took that even further when he took the reins as co-CEO of the online shoe retailer Zappos.com. And it was one of the earliest online businesses, Tony would likely say the first, that made company culture part of its brand identity. And from the beginning, he promoted a company culture that blurred the lines between boss, friend, and family. In the early 2000s, when Zappos was still a struggling startup, Tony asked employees to take pay cuts, even work for free. And for those willing to do so, Tony offered them a place to stay, setting up bunk beds in an empty loft in his building so employees could live rent-free until Zappos became successful. Zappos was a truncation of the word zapatos, which means shoes in Spanish. But Tony would become adamant that Zappos' brand identity sold something else. Happiness. Inside and out. For customers, the innovation here was Zappos offering free fast shipping, which was revolutionary at that time, with a generous 365-day return policy, and a customer service experience that felt warm and human. In a way, it was old-fashioned. Customer service was almost always done by phone. You could call them any day or night, 24/7, and a real actual person would answer your phone call and address your needs. There was no script. There was no hurry. There were stories about people who would be on the phone with a customer for up to 6 hours to resolve an issue. In an era where people were wary of shopping online, this human touch was an outstanding detail. For employees, well, they weren't employees. They were like their own species. If you worked at Zappos, you were a Zapponian. And as a Zapponian, you were one of the rare people on Earth who actually loved their job. Whether you worked in the warehouse, or design the website. You were an equal member of the team, or as Tony liked to call it, a member of his tribe. And the tribe was strengthened when the entire operation of Zappos relocated permanently to Las Vegas, Nevada in the mid-2000s. There were a couple of employees who were from Las Vegas, but most of them, they'd never been there before and they didn't know anyone. And they'd put all of their faith in Tony and in Zappos. And in his memoir, Tony describes this as the pivotal moment for the company, because no one really knew anyone in Las Vegas, including Tony. And therefore, the entire team, they spent almost all of their time together. It was all a blur. There was no real delineation between your work self and your life self. And that's the way that Tony, and apparently Zappos, liked it. When viewed in retrospect in a darker light, removing people from their friends and family and isolating them in a place that he controlled entirely through Zappos, it's a common cult-like tactic, intentional or not. And it was around this time that Tony, largely, was codifying the company's culture and conduct. He came up with a list of the 10 shared values and assumptions to guide behavior and decision-making. And although Tony often described himself as someone who was very logical and practical, these core values were certainly more qualitative than quantitative. And since this is Dead Sleep, I'll read those 10 core values out loud. Though you want to pay extra attention to the last one, number 10. 1. Deliver wow through service. 2. Embrace and drive change. 3. Create fun and a little weirdness. 4. Be adventurous, creative, and open-minded. 5. Pursue growth and learning. 6. Build open, honest relationships with communication. 7. Build a positive team and family spirit. 8. Do more with less. 9. Be passionate and determined. And 10. Be humble. Be humble. That one was very important to Tony. And while some would think that's a sign of a CEO who wants to have a respectable and respectful workplace, over time, it would seem these core values, especially be humble, would prove to be Tony's own greatest challenge. Because it was hard to be humble when you were a true genius. Tony was right out in front as the mouthpiece of this concept, that he'd found the perfect formula for success in work and in life. He said it came down to finding the 3 Ps, the right balance of profits, passion, and purpose. It was that winning formula, especially the profits, which attracted the attention of Jeff Bezos, tech's billionaire uber Alice, who was, by the way, not at all known for nurturing a passionate or purposeful employee culture. Jeff Bezos had a reputation as leading with a calculated, data-driven, revenue-generating sang-froid, a reputation that culminated in topping lists as world's worst boss. But nonetheless, Amazon acquired Zappos in 2009 for over $1 billion. Now, Tony wasn't wild about this idea, but he was co-CEO. There were other high-level stakeholders overseeing Zappos, including the mega investment company Sequoia Capital. Ultimately, Sequoia Capital, they had the final say, with the understanding that Tony and his team would maintain Zappos' unique culture. Tony Hsieh was like Jeff Bezos' fun little brother, a guy who stood out for his uniqueness from the way he dressed, showing up to photo shoots in a rumpled shirt and jeans, while the other tech heavies wore stiff tailored suits. Tony was also one of the few Asian Americans to occupy the top-level executive spot in the C-suite, but who also somehow never lost touch with the so-called little people. Tony was admired by those who knew him for his true inclusivity, before there was such a word. He had a gift for making sure everyone felt included, and was known for being a decent guy. And it wasn't long before Tony Hsieh went from one of Silicon Valley's most interesting tech execs to a whole new personality, an archetype we'd see a lot of in the coming years. The millionaire motivational speaker, also known as the social entrepreneur. This was back when TED Talks dominated popular culture and guided our collective consciousness as we all watched YouTube videos of these Silicon Valley visionaries, most of them very young, very smart, and very rich, who all appeared to have the key to success and were on the TED stage to tell you about it in an 18-minute-long monologue on how you too could live your best life. Back then, we called them thought leaders. And Tony was the model TED celebrity, young, rich, successful, with big ideas on how to make the world a better place. It was around this time that Tony announced big plans to build a whole community, a whole culture, beyond the usual company. It was called Project Downtown. It wasn't just a neighborhood. It was an ideal. And it promised to be America's greatest techtopia. And his ambitions for this place, it wasn't far off from the hipster enclaves you might have found in Brooklyn or San Francisco or Portland back then. But Tony, he was investing his own money, $350 million, to the city of Las Vegas to build this community from scratch and from the ground up. And when news hit that Zappos was actually going to be an integral part of a whole neighborhood in Las Vegas, the response was excitement. Why not? There was a billionaire who was the mayor of New York, and that seemed to be going okay. And for someone like Tony, who was respected and had big ideas and goodwill, he could accomplish things that your typical municipality could not. Tony would describe his vision of downtown Las Vegas being TED meets South by Southwest meets Burning Man, something he could scale to multiple cities. It seemed this was just the beginning for Tony. First Las Vegas, then the world. Looking back, maybe it would have been better for everyone, especially Tony, if Zappos had just sold shoes. Because shoes, they have measurements, standard sizing. Shoes either fit or they don't. Happiness, there is no measurement for happiness. No standard size. Happiness is subjective, elusive, and fleeting. So banking your whole brand and your career on the promise of happiness, it's impossible. And it's more than likely if Zappos had been about selling shoes and doing it quickly and efficiently, it would have succeeded. And maybe more important, Tony would have gotten bored and moved on, started a new company, found a new challenge. But with happiness as your core brand vibe, Tony's vision was to make Zappos more. To be like Richard Branson, whose Virgin brand was everything from a music store to an airline. And at one point, Tony approved the launch of a 3-day music festival, kind of like a Coachella, but in Vegas. And while popular with high-profile acts, the festival lost money and proved to be a pricey approach to brand awareness. And despite the happy, shiny veneer of this downtown project, there were other businesses that were flailing. The biggest issue, it seemed, was leadership, that this whole project seemed rudderless, that the investment money was there, but there was no one really in charge and able to support these teams. Tony was stretched too thin, and he was more about ideas and vision, not so much the day-to-day ops. But still, Tony, by then, had been dubbed a visionary, an expert in people over profits, and he was drilling deeper down into what he called the science of happiness. And in his memoir, Tony outlined the framework that he derived from this scientific study of happiness. That happiness is really just about 4 things: perceived control, perceived progress, connectedness, that is the number and depth of your relationships, and vision and meaning, being part of something bigger than yourself. Tony was so intrigued by this so-called science of happiness that he had science of happiness classes offered at Zappos. And he pushed his employees to see their job at Zappos not just as a job, but as a higher calling. When bad things started happening, people began to wonder if this whole delivering happiness gambit was just Tony's own deluded self-perception. Over the course of just 15 months, 3 people connected to the downtown project and Zappos took their own lives. These 3 people were from completely different backgrounds. One was an entrepreneur. The second was a young urban planner who'd come to Vegas to work on the downtown project. And the third was a barber who owned a local barbershop. But all 3 had something in common. They all relied, one way or another, on Tony Hsieh's investment. All 3 of them felt enormous pressure to succeed. And all 3 were ultimately overwhelmed, at least in part, by the prospect of their own failure. Now, the world of tech startups is notorious for pushing people past their limits, for ignoring clear signs of mental health issues, and driving people to a rise and grind culture that is detrimental to their health. Adding to that pressure was this culture of happiness. And at least for these men, they internalized the notion that failure was not an option. Now, each one of these tragic incidences, they were more complicated. But the bottom line was the community felt that Tony needed to respond. To have 3 people die by suicide in just over a year, this was troubling. They wondered, was Tony upset or worried about what was happening with this downtown project? And perhaps Tony felt badly inside. He was publicly criticized for his lack of response, coming up to the very edge of victim blaming in an interview he did. And naturally, the response to his reaction, people were angry. And he soon experienced a level of public criticism, especially in the press, that he'd never had before. As word spread about the deaths that had happened, about the failing businesses, and about what seemed like a cover-up on behalf of Tony and the company, there was some serious media backlash. Local newspapers called him the downtown Dalai Lama, and others accused him of being a phony. And his reaction to all of this appeared to be much like that worm farm, where instead of owning up to this sense of failure, he kind of backed away from this whole thing. And he introduced this revolutionary new leadership principle called holacracy. And the deal with holacracy was that there was no leadership at all, that every employee at Zappos was responsible for their own self-governance. In the way that Tony described it, it sounds simple, but the system actually complicated things much more as people scrambled to figure out what their jobs meant, how this would all work. And meanwhile, Tony made a whole other announcement that he was downsizing, simplifying his life, moving into this kind of hipster trailer park, living in an Airstream for $950 a month. And at the time, it seemed kind of cool that Tony was so humble. He was a millionaire, but he lived among the people in this trailer park. But more accurately, he was trying to retreat from his responsibilities, from the pressure, and recreate that environment that he loved back in San Francisco, renting out all of these trailers to his friends, hanging out, drinking, and partying. And the people that he used to trust, those who were his peers, who were his same age, in their 30s or even older, in their 40s and 50s, by then they'd removed themselves from Zappos and removed themselves largely from Tony's life. So by 2018, Tony was largely hanging out with people who were a lot younger than he was, people who were afraid to challenge him, those who were on his payroll. And that was the emerging irony about Zappos. How it claimed happiness as a core value, but most of the employees who worked there, if they wanted to be close to Tony, spent their workdays hunched over tiny cocktail tables in dimly lit dive bars, their faces illuminated by the harsh blue light of a computer screen. Because Zappos employees, the Zapponians, if they wanted to be near their hero, they had to find him in his natural habitat, which is by then day drinking in a local bar. When celebrities like Serena Williams would come to tour the Zappos offices, guests would marvel over the playful energy, how there was someone whose actual job title was Fungineer. An office with almost Fellini-like absurdity of over-the-top set dressing. A manic millennial workplace with cotton candy machines and Nerf guns and karaoke. But in retrospect, it was a Potemkin village, a propagandist busy town to convince the outside world and themselves that Zappos was the best place ever. But really, people were struggling. Tony seemed to be drinking a lot, and one of his most devoted underlings did notice that his eyes seemed to be turning yellow, and his hands would shake in meetings. By the summer of 2019, Tony realized he needed to make some changes, forge a new path. It had been almost 10 years since he published Delivering Happiness, and he was looking for something new. So to find his new path, he did what just about everybody in Silicon Valley does when they need enlightenment. They don't go to a therapist. You go see the Burning Man. You've likely heard of Burning Man, but you may not have seen or even realized that there is an actual Burning Man, a giant flammable figure that in the beginning, when Burning Man started in the 80s, was around 8 feet tall. These days, now that Burning Man is an epic event with thousands and thousands of people, especially tech people, descending into the desert in Nevada once a year, that Burning Man has become supersized, anywhere from 3 stories to the height of the Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center. And it's been a tradition that at the end of Burning Man, that final night, the Burning Man himself, this giant effigy, is torched. And everyone stands around and celebrates. In that year, one of those revelers, mesmerized by the fire, was Tony Hsieh. Tony had always been fascinated by fire. Fire is ingrained in one of his deepest, most precious childhood memories. A memory that's more of a blur in his subconscious. Of being a young child dazzled by fireflies. In his recollection, he could remember chasing them, trying to catch them, a sensation of leaping and flying in the air to grab one in his hands. Of course, he knew that fireflies weren't really fire, but bioluminescence. And catching fireflies was like catching happiness, that the delight was really in the chase. But as soon as you clamped it in your hand, the flicker, that life, would disappear. Tony recognized he needed to change his life, that all of that drinking, his drink of choice, was a very potent, very bitter alcohol that's uniquely popular in San Francisco called Fernet Branca. It was extremely strong, like 40% alcohol. And he was drinking shots of it every day. Tony hadn't been much of a drinker in college, but once he moved to San Francisco, he realized after a couple of drinks, he seemed more relaxed. And people even told him that they liked him better a little tipsy than they did sober. In his mind, drinking helped him be more creative. It helped him find flow. And this idea of the flow state was really important in Silicon Valley at that time. The idea that once your mind was in this perfect harmony of doing something that you so enjoyed, you were almost transported into this journey. That was the ideal. And that night in 2019 at Burning Man, he finally found the solution to his problem. The thing that could get him off of alcohol and into an incredible flow state. A little powder that someone gave him called ketamine. The person who gave it to him assured him that ketamine, it was non-addictive, there were no hangovers, there were really no negatives. That the only effect ketamine gave you, she said, was one sensation: happiness. Tony, of course, gave it a try. Over the years, the charming and boyishly handsome Tony had had many girlfriends, those who were drawn to his deep dimples as much as his deep pockets. But Tony never believed he could find that one special someone. So he was polyamorous. He had relationships with many women who were all aware of each other and all agreed to the arrangement. That he had a woman he went hiking with, a woman he went to fancy galas with, another he watched movies with, but there was no one woman he ever gave himself over to. Not completely. There was nothing in his entire life that could really captivate and hold his attention. That is, until he met Special K. Special K was the street name for ketamine. It is a drug that's been around since the 1960s, popularized in the club scene in the 1990s, and took over Silicon Valley in the mid-2000s. Most of us are just hearing about ketamine now, but in Silicon Valley, they pride themselves on being years ahead of the rest of us on ways that they can hack their bodies and their minds. And it's not considered unusual or odd to try extreme things to get yourself into that flow state, that perfect harmony of body and mind. For some, that's extreme calorie restriction, like Jack Dorsey, the former owner of Twitter. For others, it was psychedelics, mushrooms, and ayahuasca. But ketamine offered something that a lot of these high-pressure CEOs couldn't get anywhere else. True relief. Because ketamine offered not a high exactly, more like a disassociative euphoria of being outside yourself. Tony took to the drug ketamine instantly. It gave him that profound, infinite happiness that he'd been looking for. And it's worth noting that there have been studies that in a controlled environment, ketamine can help people with depression. The crucial difference was Tony wasn't using it in a controlled environment. He was taking ketamine liberally and recreationally. And he was so into it, he had bought several copies of a book called The Little Book of Ketamine and handed it out to people. He also coerced his colleagues, some of them significantly younger than Tony, to do ketamine with him. And some of them obliged, thinking it would bring them closer to their mentor. But Tony was taking mass quantities of ketamine, and the side effects were giving him hallucinations and pushing him one snort at a time into a strange and long-term psychosis. What I found most shocking was how quickly this all happened. That within 6 months, Tony was hooked on ketamine and behaving very erratically. The Matrix was always one of Tony's favorite movies. And now, on ketamine, he started to believe The Matrix was real. That he'd invite a coworker to come over, snort ketamine with him, and he would play Neo, and the other person would play Morpheus. It all kind of came to a head around the time of the Sundance Film Festival in January of 2020. And just after the film festival, Tony stayed in Park City and checked himself into a rehab. A rehab where he only spent 2 weeks, which was by all accounts not nearly enough to help him resolve this ketamine addiction, or even really get his brain back from the brink of psychosis. Tony was still, at least in name, the CEO of Zappos. But he decided to stay in Utah, buying a huge mansion just outside of Park City. And it was there his addiction descended into something so tragic and so bizarre that it's hard to fathom. Because he transitioned from using ketamine to becoming addicted to nitrous oxide. Cartridges and cartridges of nitrous oxide called whippets, doing up to 50 cartridges a day. The pandemic only worsened the situation. And this is the most brutal irony of all, that a man who once strived to deliver happiness all over the world was in the end reduced to living in a single room in complete squalor, huffing on canisters of laughing gas. Now, for most people who struggle with addiction, there's usually a bottom, a moment of reckoning. You lose a job, you lose your money, you lose everybody in your life that you love. But for Tony, it was complicated because he had infinite resources, millions and millions and millions of dollars. When you have that kind of money, well, you always have friends. His real friends had been pushed out of the picture months and months earlier as Tony's addiction spiraled. And the only member of his family who was still allowed to be in Tony's sphere was his younger brother, Andy. And even that relationship was complicated. Andy had negotiated a salary from his brother for his care, and that salary was $1 million a year. Andy and Tony had always had a fraught relationship because Tony was the golden boy and Andy had been less successful. So friends of Tony weren't sure if Andy was really there to help or if he was just enabling his brother's dangerous behavior. Tony was clearly not himself. He would do strange and sadistic things, like make people do timeouts and stand in the corner if they said something that upset him. At the same time, he was strangely generous, offering people millions of dollars for nonsensical things. And by the summer of 2020, he was surrounded by sycophants, people who would do anything he said for the right price. By the fall of 2020, there was only one person left who stood a chance of getting through to Tony. And it wasn't someone in the tech world. It was the musician, the famous singer, Jewel. Jewel and Tony had become friendly. They'd met at a conference a couple of years earlier, and they'd stayed in touch. Jewel believed Tony was a genius and found his perspective and vision inspiring. And Tony admired Jewel's talent and her work in mental health. But it was when Jewel came to Utah, she had to basically push her way past his security, past all of these hipster sycophants, and found him alone and looked horribly sick, with hollow eyes and a bruised body. She knew Tony needed help right away. But the more she tried to talk sense into him, the less he would listen. And he told her that anyone who wasn't aligned with his ecosystem, well, he had to get rid of them. Jewel left early, but she was horrified by what she saw. And she actually tried to stage an intervention, but it didn't work. But she did write Tony a letter. And it was probably the first time in years that there was someone who told him the truth. And Jewel did not mince words. Here's a little sample from her letter. The people you are surrounding yourself with are either ignorant or willing to be complicit in you killing yourself. You sound like a crazy person when you are talking and no one seems to be telling you. Please don't be like the stereotype of a billionaire who surrounds himself with yes men and goes from eccentric to madness, but never sees the line that is crossed because he won't listen to anyone that loves him. You made some sort of promise to humanity when you were young, to solve complex problems and create connection. But no one worth their salt will take you seriously right now. I say this with love, and as possibly the only person in your circle who is not on your payroll. Tony did not heed Jewel's advice, but the letter meant enough to him that he did have it taped up on a window in the mansion for everyone to see. Tony was in Connecticut just before Thanksgiving. He, with his entourage of hangers-on, people who either worked for him or considered themselves friends, that they'd only known him for a few months, and had somehow managed to get him to give them millions of dollars, promissory notes written on Post-its. For whatever reason, Tony got in an argument with someone, eventually ending up in the backyard shed. And when they went to check on him, they noticed that he had burning candles and was lighting little pieces of paper on fire. There were so many different people serving so many of his different needs at different times. Some of them weren't aware that he was lighting matches and putting things on fire, and others thought it was a good idea to bring him a propane heater so he wouldn't get cold at night. And at around 3 o'clock in the morning on November 19th, Tony's brother went to check on him, and he smelled smoke. And along with the smell of smoke and licks of flames, there was a loud hissing sound. Concerned, he tried to open the shed and realized that his brother had somehow either locked or barricaded the door. He couldn't get in. The small shed was soon consumed by flames. And it wasn't until the firefighters arrived that they were able to extract Tony from the burning structure. At first there was hope, because miraculously, his body was barely burned. Tony was rushed to the hospital and was quickly placed in ICU. At first, it looked like he might recover, but doctors realized they had underestimated the amount of carbon monoxide poisoning. He was basically on life support and brain dead. After 9 days in a coma, Tony was pronounced dead the day after Thanksgiving in 2020. Tony's death and his cause of death, it shocked the world. He was beloved by everyone, and very few had any idea of what he was going through. But soon, it was revealed that Tony had no will, with legal battles in court that lasted years. And during those legal battles, something about Tony was revealed. That through his whole life, he'd struggled with anxiety and depression and insomnia, all of the things that everyday humans deal with. In his memoir, he mentioned social anxiety, but not anything life-changing or significant. And that was his choice. But you have to wonder that there could have been a different path if he'd been open to delivering more than happiness and had been more transparent about his pain, about his struggles. That would have helped a lot of people. And perhaps a humbler version of Zappos would have been enough. That in the end, if you want to walk the path, you don't need some big grand vision. You don't need $1 billion. You really just need a comfortable pair of shoes. Because the path to happiness can't be delivered to your doorstep or dictated by some billionaire, but best discovered on our own. Thanks for listening, and a reminder that Dead Sleep Naked will be dropping in a couple of days. So if you get a chance, subscribe so you don't miss it. Good night.